My name is Adam Wagner and I act for the clinically vulnerable families. I'm assisted by Lamisa Iqbal and we are instructed by Kim Harrison and Shane Smith of Slater and Gordon. CVF is very grateful to you, Chair, for granting them core participant status in this module, and they're looking forward to assisting the inquiry and continuing to be the voice of the clinically vulnerable in this inquiry. My submissions will address, first of all, clinically vulnerable children must not be sidelined again. Second of all, provisional outline of scope. Third, expert evidence. And fourth, key lines of inquiry. Chair, you are already familiar with CVF through their participation in modules 3 and 4 as core participants. In short, CVF is a grassroots organisation which was founded in August 2020 in the first months of the pandemic. Since then, it's helped thousands of people through its advocacy and advice. It represents those who are clinically vulnerable, clinically extremely vulnerable, and the severely immunosuppressed, as well as their households across all 4 nations. And when I refer to clinically vulnerable, I include all of those groups going forward. CVF, when it was founded, initially concentrated on issues relating to unsafe schools, and it then broadened its focus to other areas. We've listed in our written submissions at paragraph 9 the extensive activities CVF have been involved in and still are involved in relating to schools. For example, fighting for cleaner air in schools, advocating for children and CV families who had not been vaccinated, campaigning for masking in schools, highlighting inequalities for children forced out of schools due to COVID, helping families locate appropriate educational resources when their children were not supported through the formal education system, advising families how to mitigate risks so their children could attend schools more safely, campaigning for safer exam conditions, addressing inequalities faced by children and young people in clinically vulnerable households, and highlighting problems faced by children who were locked out of education due to high clinical risks. My first topic, an overarching topic, is that clinically vulnerable children and young people must not be sidelined again. CVF is involved in a number of inquiry modules, but it has a simple overarching aim, which is this: to ensure the inquiry investigates the full impact of the pandemic on the clinically vulnerable and their families and households. Those individuals not only faced, but continue to face greater risks to their lives than any other category of person. We do not argue with the disability rights groups about terminology, and we understand there are controversies, but we, as the clinically vulnerable, representing the clinically vulnerable, did not choose to be designated as clinically vulnerable. And that is the term that I use for that reason. But those groups included millions of people, millions who are at higher risk from COVID-19, and who made up the vast majority of those who died as a result of COVID-19. There is an important point here. The clinically vulnerable are not other people. They are us. They are our families, our loved ones. And that means advocating for clinically vulnerable people to be protected. And that's not at the expense of anyone else. It's about upholding the essential values of our society. The measures that CVF and its members advocate for and have advocated for throughout the pandemic: high quality masks, clean air, ventilation, just to name 3. These are measures which do not just help clinically vulnerable people, they make things better for everyone. And that includes improving the attendance of children at schools and their families. On this, we make a point which should be an important one in this module. The public debate over children in the pandemic often made it seem as if there was only one important question: schools open or schools shut, as if there was a switch. But this masked 2 other important questions: are schools safe, and can they be made safe? Counsel to the inquiry has said this module will consider infection prevention and control. We say that should be a central focus. CVF were asking the questions from early on in the pandemic. Is the air in schools safe? Can it be made cleaner? Why not bring in inexpensive air filters? Why not ventilate more? Why not use high-quality masks? When it is safe enough for the most vulnerable to attend, it's safe enough for everyone. These questions were urgent and remain urgent. Chair, you have obtained extremely useful evidence on IPCs in Module 3, the healthcare module, which gets to the heart of those questions. We hope that this evidence is brought across, and also the learning from this evidence, to this module, and taken seriously in answering the questions about what should have happened and how we can make the schools safe in the future. And we do support the TUC's position that the safety of school staff could be considered by this module, not as a central focus, but as a focus, because it is impossible to assess the proportionality of IPC measures without understanding the impact on staff. To ignore the impact of staff would be to miss a central part of the balancing exercise. So that's my first point. Don't forget clinically vulnerable children. My second topic is clinically vulnerable children and young people must not be sidelined. Many of the children and young people who are the focus of this module are clinically vulnerable. Many more live in households with clinically vulnerable family members. At this stage, I want to read the opening lines from an article in the Irish Independent, which appeared just yesterday by Tess Finch-Lee. "It's not your fault," I told 16-year-old Cara, whose mother died of SARS-CoV-2 infection she gave her. To be clear, the doctor confirmed Cara, not her real name, had passed on the virus, and COVID was entered on the death certificate as the cause of death. Cara's mother had not been outside of their home in the weeks preceding her death. When masks were dropped in the Omicron is mild phase of the pandemic, Cara continued as the lone masker at school to protect her immunocompromised mother who was undergoing chemotherapy. It was tolerable until a child psychotherapist said on national airwaves that some girls were continuing to mask anyway to hide their acne. His words were used to bully her. Cara left, but without support from the teachers, she struggled. Her parents pleaded with the school to help use the HEPA filter they brought. The school refused. Cara eventually returned to school unmasked, caught COVID and infected her mum. It killed her. Cara self-harms because she blames herself. She hasn't been to school since. This is a powerful and upsetting story which no doubt was reflected by similar stories in the UK too. And it highlights a number of interlinked issues which we say should be investigated in this module. The experience of children with clinically vulnerable family members, the attitude of schools and society generally towards important IPC measures. One of CVF's primary focuses in this module is to ensure that CV children and young people and those who lived in clinically vulnerable households are not forgotten, as they were during the height of the pandemic and in pandemic planning. At present, Chair, we are concerned that there is no mention of the clinically vulnerable in the provisional list of issues. There is no mention of the clinically vulnerable in the key lines of inquiry. We appreciate those are provisional early documents, but we say, respectfully, it has to change. We hope this will shortly be rectified. My third topic is provisional outline of scope. There is no mention of clinically vulnerable children or children in clinically vulnerable families in the scope. We do appreciate, Chair, CTI's point this morning, the scope is not meant to be exhaustive, and there are some broad categories which will include other subcategories. But the scope does refer explicitly to 8 subgroups of children: children with disabilities, those with special educational needs, children at risk, children whose families receive support from social services, young carers, those in the care of local authorities, care and care leavers, children and young people in contact with the immigration system. Of course, we understand CTI's point, but we also highlight the practical reality that once a group is explicitly mentioned in the scope, that explicit mention cascades down to many other inquiry actions and activities. So, we have proposed an addition to the scope in the opening paragraph which is in red text in paragraph 16 of our submissions, which simply would add a line which says those who are clinically vulnerable and/or clinically extremely vulnerable and/or who are part of families of clinically vulnerable and clinically extremely vulnerable people. It's important to note that, and I've said this before in other modules, although of course it's important to focus on disabled children, not all disabled children are clinically vulnerable and not all clinically vulnerable children are disabled. And moreover, children in clinically vulnerable households, like Cara in the article, don't fit in anywhere in these categories. This makes sense in the context of other aspects of the inquiry's work too. For example, it's already been said that clinically vulnerable children are being included in the research topics for Module 8. So we say they should be in the scope too. CVF also requests the inquiry make sure it considers children who were removed from the school role, whilst also recognising the significant impact of nearly half of CVS families who were told to withdraw their children from the school roles under the threat of fines and prosecutions. Only a small number went to court, but many withdrew, mostly temporarily, or felt compelled to take unnecessary risks. My next topic is expert evidence. We note that paragraph 44 of CTI's note refers to the experience of children with special educational needs and disabilities during the pandemic and the impact of the pandemic on them. CVF are keen that the experience of clinically vulnerable children and also children who lived in clinically vulnerable households are considered by experts in this module explicitly. And I've already explained why they're different to other groups and they need specific consideration. In our written submissions at paragraph 20, we've proposed the names of 3 experts who we propose would be well suited to this task. And we've also proposed another another potential expert who can deal with the question of how COVID-19 compares to other vaccine preventable diseases in terms of severe, acute and long-term disease in children and young people. And again, we've made a proposal. My final topic, Chair, is key lines of inquiry. From paragraph 23 of our submissions, we've respectfully made some proposals, again in red, for additions to the key lines of inquiry. I will not refer to them in detail now, but I make the point again that the CLOEs, as the acronym has come to be referred to, make no mention at all of clinically vulnerable children or people in clinically vulnerable families. And that, in my submission, is no surprise because they don't appear in the scope either. And if they don't appear in the scope, it doesn't cascade down to other parts of the inquiry's work. And we say that our proposed changes will ensure that the clinically vulnerable people are included, paid attention to, and their experience are appropriately investigated in Module 3. We, of course, only propose those as ideas. The point is just to get them in somehow. In conclusion, Chair, many children and young people are clinically vulnerable. Many more live in households with clinically vulnerable people. They have largely been forgotten during the pandemic and certainly have been forgotten since the pandemic. Since the acute phase of the pandemic. In this important module, there is a chance to begin rectifying that, but it will only happen if clinically vulnerable children and families are placed at the centre of this module, in the issues list, in the key lines of inquiry, in the expert evidence. We hope that having granted CVF core participant status, you will now take these important steps to ensure the voice of the clinically vulnerable people can be heard. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Wagner. Very grateful.